In this episode of the Project Management Podcast, we look into a crystal ball to see how project management is changing and how modern tools and emerging technologies impact the way you'll manage your projects in the future.
Hello and welcome to the Project Management Podcast at pm-podcast.com. I am Cornelius Fichtner. We are coming to you live from the thought-provoking 2018 PMI Global Conference in Chicago. And I have moved on to room 474B, and I'm sitting here opposite Stephen May from the Projectified with PMI podcast. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Cornelius. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for being here. Absolutely great. So you are the host of Projectified with PMI, a new podcast that PMI is launching here at the Congress. Why has PMI finally, only after 12 years of me doing it, decided to start their own podcast?
Well, it was important to make sure you had a large bank of material that we could rip off and republish. I think that was I think it was just time. I mean, you look at what PMI's mission is in the world and kind of where it fits, and PMI paying particular attention to responding to where the market is going, where people get their information, not only the current community of not just people who call themselves project managers, but people who get up every day and go to work and do something that's significant in a project or multiple projects, not just the ones today, but those coming up. And I think it became clear, and again, I, of course, wasn't in those conversations initially, but I think it became clear that this was an important way to make information available to people on the go, on their schedule, wherever they happen to be. I mean, personally, I like to consume podcasts when I run. So, that's the kind of thing that doesn't work for a lot of formats, but works well with this. And I think it was about meeting people where they are.
What's the focus of your podcast?
It's really around what's next. It's really focused on being forward-looking on those subjects, those concepts, those ideas, those insights that are relevant to people doing important project work. So if you could imagine this kind of core space of what we think of as project management knowledge and skill and technique, and even if you were to take, for example, the PMBOK and the Agile Practice Guide, and if you were to say, well, that's a pretty good way of describing what's in that core space. Well, around that, there are all these other disciplines and all these other ways of thinking and skills and techniques that make the person practicing those processes effective. So this could range from, do I understand what's coming in artificial intelligence? Do I understand the difference in leading or managing or structuring a digital transformation project? Even, do I understand the science and art of influence? And so those are the kinds of topics where we go find people that have done deep research or are deep practitioners or have really studied these topics and are able to communicate, here's what's coming and here's how you as a project professional need to be prepared to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. And since PMI has chosen you to be the host of this forward-looking podcast, there has to be a story behind this. So what is your personal interest in regards to where project management is heading?
Yeah, so outside of the podcast and other media-related work that I do, I'm also a consultant. So my consulting focus is in the area of business transformation, of disruptive transformation, of strategic change. And in that space, you have to execute. So no matter how brilliant the insight, no matter how major or minor the change, no matter how important to the organization or the company, it all comes down to whether or not you effectively execute. And you execute in the context of projects. So to me, there is no execution without effective project management, whether you call it that or something else. And when I look at that, I take kind of a broad view of, okay, I include in there, how do we identify risk? How do we track and manage risk? How do we escalate decisions? How do we structure governance and oversight? How do we build portfolios of projects that can effectively move a change forward? And then how do we manage them? So for me, that's a critical component that relates not only to some of my own history around project management, but in the consulting work that I do today.
Mm. When I look at my phone, I see that it has downloaded 3 episodes of Projectified with PMI, at least this morning, unless you published one throughout the day. I'd like to take a look at what your guests had to say so far on your program. Please tell us, what do you think is the most surprising, interesting, stimulating prediction that you have taken away from the interviews? Beginning with episode 1 of your podcast with Anand Swaminathan.
Yeah, that's a brilliant guy. We talked with Anand Swaminathan about digital transformation, and we covered a lot of ground. And there's no way, of course, we could include everything that was there. But some of the things that really stood out to me was one of the facts that he brought. He said, 90% of the world's data has been created in the last 2 years. And so when you start thinking about the implications of digital transformation and why the digital transformation space has been accelerating the way that it has, you say, this is crazy. Is it possible that 90% of the world's data has been created in the last 2 years? So that for me, just in itself, was kind of eye-opening. Well, he kind of bookended that later in the interview. He also said, look, digital transformation is relevant to every industry. He may have even said, I'd have to go back, he may have even said every organization. So you could stand here today and say, oh, well, wait a second. I can see this in some specific industries, particularly those that are traditionally very data-driven. But he would use examples from industries that you would think, there's no way that's a digital transformation play, heavy equipment, this kind of thing. So that to me was fascinating, this idea of this massive acceleration of data creation, and then the idea that this is relevant to everybody. Now, you could debate him one way or the other, but he made a pretty compelling case.
Mm-hmm. Episode 2 was with Dr. Michael Chui. What did you take away from that?
Yeah, this is a guy, not only is he brilliant, but you kind of like him right away. So I really enjoyed talking to him. I had not met him before we talked in advance of the podcast and then did the recording. We talked with him about kind of this broad area of automation, digitization, artificial intelligence. And one of the things that he brought forward was, he said, look, in the research that we did, and he was involved in real research, and he said in the research that we did, he said 50% of the tasks being done today, we looked across a huge range of industries, a huge range of job types, a huge range of tasks being done. 50% of the tasks being done today can be automated by simply adapting currently available technology. 50%. Now, he doesn't mean that is already happening, but he's saying 50% can be automated with currently available technology. Well, I thought that in itself was fantastic. Well, that kind of moved into this conversation around, so what does that mean? Is this one of those, and you could decide, is it utopian or dystopian, depending on which author you're reading. But is this a vision of a place where everybody lays around on lounge chairs because all the work has been automated? But he makes a fantastic case that no, it's not that at all. He said, not only do we need the robots working as hard as they can, he said we need everybody working next to them. And he went on to describe that the simple change in global demographics has created a scenario where we absolutely not only have the opportunity for everyone to do meaningful work, we really need for everybody to be working. So whether that's good news to some or bad news to some, he paints this picture of rapidly accelerating automation and digitization, but it doesn't do away with the need for all of us to stay busy at work. Mm-hmm. Well, again, was fascinating to me.
And then in episode 3, you interviewed Jacqueline Van Pelt. What did she have to say?
Yeah, so Jacqueline Van Pelt is, not to make this about age, but Jacqueline Van Pelt was one of the younger interviews, and one of the younger guests, and one of the reasons we wanted to talk to her. We wanted to get a perspective from someone who is earlier in her career compared to many that we talked to, and yet has done great things in the project and program space already. And one of the things that was interesting coming from Jacqueline Van Pelt, was this idea that as you're coming up as a young person coming up in companies full of smart people, and she's worked in engineering heavy environments, a lot of well-educated, really smart people. She says, you have got to first believe that you deserve a seat at the table. You've got to believe that before you expect someone else to listen to you, before you expect someone else to offer that invitation. You have to believe that you deserve a seat at the table. Well, she kind of doubled down on that and went on to talk about the fact that not only do you have to believe you deserve a seat at the table, you've got to be willing to bring the courage to say the awkward thing. You've got to be willing to bring the awkward feedback, to make the awkward observation, to say that this isn't going to work out when the popular word is that this is going to be fine. And coming from someone, again, not to make it so much about age, but someone who is still earlier in her career, is still a younger person, but has already gained these kinds of insights. Now, when I pushed on her a bit, because it was impressive, actually, what the sort of depth of what she was bringing, one of the things that became clear was she lives in this space of an incredible gratitude toward people that have mentored her. You know, she repeatedly would talk about those that had been able to guide her, to mentor her, to coach her, to set positive examples for her. And I thought there was this sort of very powerful story that came through. You know, someone that had done the hard work of preparing, so she had a great education, she had taken great positions, she had worked hard, and people that came around her and coached her, prepared her, mentored her, and she's already showing a level of maturity and insight that's just beyond what you would expect in just years of experience.
At this point, many of our listeners are probably going, oh my God, this sounds great. Where on earth can I subscribe to this podcast?
Well, the first place to go is pmi.org/podcast. You can definitely get it there. But the other outlets that you would expect, so from iTunes, Stitcher,
Google Play Music.
Yes, Google Play Music, thank you. And I'm sure I'm leaving some out. But basically, you know how they say on the commercials, where podcasts are sold?
So basically, if you're listening to this podcast in the podcast app on your phone or tablet, hit search.
It's there.
Projectified with PMI, you will find it.
It's there.
Yeah. Stephen, for you personally, what is the number one trend that you are currently seeing in project management?
You know, this is almost so obvious, I hate to say it, but it's agile. It's agile. You know, it's this move toward agile, and for some that is just trying to get a toe in the water. For some, it's trying to build some support in their organization. For others that are years, in some cases quite a few years, into that space, it's about understanding that it's not pure agile, whatever we once imagined that to be, but it's about hybrid. It's about hybrid thinking. It's about maybe one part of the project is done from what we think of as a more traditional project, traditional waterfall perspective, but we then move into an agile approach or agile approaches for development purposes. In some cases, it's bringing a particular technique, you know, we're going to use Kanban boards or something else as a way to create value in a particular project. That, of course, leads into the whole discussion around, are we going to lead differently? Are we going to organize differently? You know, are we going to trust these self-organizing teams or not? Will our leadership team get behind that? There is no bigger trend in project management than agile, and I think that's going to be the case for the foreseeable future.
And what does that mean for our listeners in terms of their professional development, the courses they take, and preparing themselves? Well,
I think it's just that. It is that they have to prepare. You know, I don't think there's any reason why someone who is relatively, well, even if you say mid-career, so someone who's early career, mid-career, there's no reason that they should believe they can continue with really strong, desirable career advancement over the next 10 or 15 years if they are not capable in this area. So I think it is about, first of all, understanding, you know, what are we talking about? So just the initial reading, there's tons of information available now. You know, there's a ton of information available from PMI. There's a ton of information available from other sources. PMI has just recently released the Agile Practice Guide, which is a great place to start. You know, you want to take a well thought through, well organized approach at describing what Agile is all about and what you need to be preparing for. It's a great place to start. But I believe that people need to start getting educated, but also begin looking for the opportunities to bring Agile practices into what they're already doing. You know, they don't have to sell their organization on this wholesale transformation. We're somehow going to leave everything that we've been doing in more traditional waterfall spaces, and we're all 18 months from now going to be, you know, pure play Agile. That's not going to happen anyway, but you don't have to do that. You can begin to understand the mindsets, the ways of organizing, the ways of managing, and some people in Agile don't like the word managing, but the ways of managing, the ways of approaching the work, and even simple techniques that you can begin to pull in. And so not only are you likely to find opportunities to create value in your projects and value in your organization, but you're now starting to learn. You're now starting to build that capability. And as opportunities become available to you or as you create them for yourself, when those require that you have some Agile experience, some Agile capabilities, then you've already built it. If you wait until the entire world is more Agile, and likely what it's going to be is an Agile hybrid, you're going to be way behind the curve.
In the opening, you promised us that we'd be looking into a crystal ball. We've already done that a little bit there with looking at the 3 interviews that you discussed and what the surprising thing says that your guests brought up. I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about how you feel the following developments are going to be affecting project management. And let's start with the obvious, digitalization.
So let's first be fair that what I'm really doing here is channeling the guest. So what I want to bring you is what I've heard, what I think I've learned from our guest. Sure, I'm a consultant also, and I've got a certain level of exposure and experience, but you're going to ask me about some things here around which I can't claim the depth of expertise of the people that we've been talking to. So that's my caveat. So you first ask about digitalization. So if we take what the researchers and the guests that we're talking to say on this topic, then the more you can become familiar with the ways digitalization are showing up in your industry, then the much better you're going to be positioned to succeed. One of the messages that came through, and I wish I could name each of the guests, it came through probably in 2 or 3 interviews, was this idea that most people are not doing enough to become smart about their own industry. They may be doing a great job in the job they're doing today, and so that's not to be negative or to be critical. They may be doing a wonderful job in the job that they're doing today, but not doing enough to learn everything they can learn about how digitalization is going to affect their space. So whether that is, you could range from whether that's from healthcare on one end to heavy equipment on another. Digitalization is going to continue to be a factor. And again, just like we talked about Agile, it's about preparing. So the project you're on right now may not require you to be an expert in how other organizations and companies in your space and in adjacent spaces have been affected, but the next one might. So making it your job to get really smart about how things are changing and what the future is in your own industry becomes probably one of the most important steps.
How about artificial intelligence?
So this one is funny. You get people who are close to it, people like we talked about, Michael Chui, for example, doing research there. And, they will argue that we're moving more and more into a space where artificial intelligence is going to be a part of absolutely everything that we're doing. We may not sense it. We may not be. It may not be on the surface, and maybe that's part of the play. The idea that it's not obvious, but more and more that artificial intelligence will be a part of everyone's experience. So if you say, well, a project manager, then it probably is going to vary tremendously depending on what industry in which you manage. If you're someone who manages IT projects, that's probably going to be a very different experience than if you're someone, who manages construction projects. But what seems clear, again, what our guests would argue, is that wherever you are in there, it's going to change your industry. We talked to one person whom we haven't had a chance to interview yet, who makes a case about the way artificial intelligence is going to continue to affect project management itself. Where so many of the things that we think today as being somewhat manual or intentional tasks that project managers and project leaders and project administrators are doing, that the future is not too far away, that many of those things can be predicted and executed through artificial intelligence. So, I hate to parrot what I was saying a moment ago, but I still think it goes back to understanding where the leading edge is for your industry and getting really, really smart there. And there's probably no better way to prepare. At least that's what a lot of our guests would argue.
You mentioned that, the number one trend that you're seeing is agile, and you really have to get started with that personally as a project manager to get training in that. Digitalization, artificial intelligence, how do I get that inside of me? Training, reading, where do I find out about it?
Yeah, again, I'm going to rely on what I've learned from our guest. I think in most cases, our guest would argue that it's not a one-stop shop. It's not a go read this one book or take this one class, but that it's really a combination of looking at the industry in which you expect to continue to work and intersecting that with what's happening in digitization, in artificial intelligence, in automation, in that space. And then obviously adjacent spaces. I mean, sometimes you can look and say, okay, maybe the automotive industry is going to dramatically change because of a growing emphasis on alternative fuels, alternative energy. So you may be looking at both, but it really is about identifying where the intersection is. So today, I don't think there's a one-stop shop. I think it's getting really smart about your industry. And of course, that's the usual, that's the trade publications, the HBRs, what's happening in the news today is not a bad source. And then the other sources, again, the magazines, the books, and there's a ton of online stuff that's even free. I mean, if you, for example, are listening to this and you say, well, I don't even really understand the basics of what artificial intelligence means, you can go pull up an endless list of, YouTube videos that'll do whiteboard talks and whatever else to lay that out for you. So it becomes a matter of figuring out where you're going to focus and really getting smart about that intersection. I think the fool's errand would be, I'm going to understand everything there is to understand about automation. It's just, I don't know where anyone would even begin, at least not an adult with a job. I don't know how you would approach that. But what you can do is get extremely smart about automation as it affects your industry or your space.
To close out the interview, please paint us a picture of how you see the future of project management.
Sure. One of the things, so you asked me before what I've picked up as the most significant trend, and I don't think there's any way to get around, Agile is the 800-pound gorilla. But other things that have really come through for me, and if I go outside of the podcast, go outside of the guests that we've talked to recently, and they're a really impressive group of people, but let's go outside of that. So I've been involved in interviewing people, leaders in the project management space and in surrounding spaces, and participating in sort of large project management events, global events, for at least a decade. And I tell people all the time, I said, when I reflect back on that, so hundreds of interviews, hundreds of presentations, I don't know how many different events, one of the things that is clear to me is that there's been a growing sophistication in the space. And what I mean by that, not that it has become more technically sophisticated, but if you take the assumption, and I think this is true actually, that there is this strong, well thought through technical core. There are good processes, there are good tools, there are good ways of organizing and managing work and all the pieces around that. But the way the conversation has changed is toward things like, do you understand how to lead? Do you understand how to build trust? Do you understand how to influence in situations where you don't have positional authority? Do you understand how to influence or organize or create change? Create's probably not the right word there, but do you understand your role in and helping others to lead change? So it's all these other pieces where it seems that there's kind of this unstated thing where everyone says, look, we get the techniques, we get the technical core, and now what we're trying to do is become real sophisticated business leaders with what, and I kind of hate the term, but a strong suite of soft skills to help make all of that great technical core really, really powerful. So now what does that mean? Well, that's my observation over 10 years of watching it. what I think that means is that your project managers a few years from now, they still have to have a strong technical core. That has to be addressed one way or the other. Now, we could argue whether that all resides in the same person or not, but these people can't be just project managers, as in the kind of low end of project administrator. They have got to be business leaders. So they've got to be savvy about the business. They've got to be savvy about what makes that business and that industry work. They've got to be savvy about leadership. They've got to understand change. They've got to understand creating alignment. They've got to understand negotiation. They've got to understand influence. So they've really got to be sophisticated leaders. And I think for me, that's probably, yes, Agile's the obvious thing, but next to that or interwoven with that is this move toward a very sophisticated leader that cannot get by purely on technical skill.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time today, Stephen.
It has been my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Cornelius.